So we should be recording again. Nice. All right. So welcome back. Hope you all got nice pieces of coffee and are refueled and ready to put more stuff into your heads. So let's revisit. In the first half, we outlined a way of thinking about biological systems as performing Bayesian inference. And we went through this slightly roundabout way of homeostasis and non-equilibrium steady states. But in the end, we got to this idea that we can represent biological systems as probabilistic models, and we can think of staying alive as a process of Bayesian inference. You are trying to align various variables of the system to some set of target priors that describe all the stuff we need to care about in order to stay alive. And then we had sort of a brief excursion into what a system is. And we came forward with this notion that we can delineate a system using a Markov blanket, i.e. a set of nodes that where given that set of nodes, two parts of a graph are independent of each other. And we name one part the system, with all its internal states, and the other part the world with everything else in it. That was sort of the sketch of what we did in the first half. Now, in the second half, what I want to try and do is I want to take this way of thinking and I want to show you some of the kinds of things that people are doing with us and some of the ways this way of thinking about the world can manifest in what I think are really, really cool ideas. Excuse me. So first, we're going to look at one of my all-time favorite ideas, which is the Bayesian brain hypothesis. Then we're going to revisit the idea of the free energy, and I'm going to show you some applications of this, because we're also engineers, so applications are cool. And then finally, we're going to try and see if we have time to just hit you with a bunch of ways that people are extending upon this idea, and just try to really crank this thing up to 11. And again, if at any point you have any questions or comments, just feel free to interrupt me. All right, so without further ado, let's talk about Bayesian brains. The Bayesian brain idea, Bayesian brain hypothesis, is not new. So this handsome gentleman we see here again is, if there are any Germans in the audience, I apologize for the horrible pronunciation. He is Hermann von Helmholtz. He was a brilliant scientist working in the 1800s. And to paraphrase him, where this idea originates, as far as I can tell, so that perception is inference of the causes of observed impressions upon our sensorium. Which is a bit of a mouthful to say out loud, but all it really means is that perception, the act of perceiving something, can be cast as an inference process about what is the state of the world that caused this observation. So again, for instance, right now, your sensorium is being bombarded with sound waves. And you are correctly inferring that the most likely cause of those sound waves is that I'm here and I'm talking and you are in a lecture. And that gives you your perception of the world right now. The Bayesian brain hypothesis states that basically, at its core, the brain is a prediction machine. The brain is a generative model, and it is in the business of trying to make sense of all of the data, all of the sensory data that's constantly bombarding you. So inside of your head is a generative model of the world around you. That's sort of the core idea of the Bayesian brain, which to me is really, really interesting. Now, Helmholtz, back in the day, he was kind of limited in how well he could actually study the brain. So at the time, this was mostly an idea. He was limited because this was the 1800s. If you wanted to look at a brain, you would have to find a person, you would have to open their skull and literally take a look at the brain, which, as you can imagine, is not particularly conducive to figuring out the kinds of computations that are going on inside of the brain. Fortunately, we've gotten a bit better since. We now have various different imaging techniques that we can use to collect data about brains while they're doing different tasks. And from that, we can try to sort of poke and prod at this little thing in order to see if we can make sense of what it does. And it turns out that Helmholtz might not have been that far off. So the next slide I'm going to show you has a figure from one of my all-time favorite papers. And it is a figure that shows single neuron recordings from a rat from its dopaminergic system. Single neuron recordings are basically where you stick an electrode inside the brain of the animal, and then whenever the neuron fires, whenever there's a spike, you record it. So you get these spike trains. Use that to measure when neurons are reacting to different things. This figure is particularly cool because it's testing directly this idea that there's a generative model inside of the brain. So to sort of paint the picture of the experimental setup here, is we have a rat, and it is living in a cage, and it is, ratting around. It is doing rat things and going about its very ratty business. And then every now and then it gets a drop of juice. It gets a reward. And rats like juice, because like most of us, rats like food, and sweet things taste good. So juice is rewarding to a rat. What they very cleverly did here is they also taught the rat that when a light flashed, then a second after, a little more than a second after, it would get a reward. So the rat learned this association between flashing light, drop of juice, flashing light, reward. And at this point, when these recordings were taken, the rat had already learned this. Like any of you who decide to go further into neuroscience, especially into decision neuroscience and the like, you are going to see this recording again. These are probably some of the most famous single neuron recordings ever done. It's just beautiful, beautiful science. So we're just going to talk through each of these figures in order, and we're going to start at the top. So the way to read this figure is that each row represents a single neuron that's being recorded. So naturally, they collect data from a bunch of neurons. Each black dot represents a spike. And that'll give you this nice sort of spotted pattern that you see over time going from left to right. So like this thing here. If you sum it up, you get this nice skyline looking pattern at the top. And then there are two different parts that are labeled. There's this R here, which is this is when a reward occurs. And there's the CS, which is when the conditioned stimulus occurs. So when the light's flashing. Now let's just go through these figures and see what we can glean from them. So the first figure here There's no conditioned stimulus, so the rat is just ratting about, it's going about its business. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a reward appears. And what we see is that immediately following the reward, we have a spike, we have an increase in activity in these neurons. These neurons are reacting to reward all of a sudden happening. All of a sudden, there's something nice happening. Oh my God, this is amazing. Neurons are firing, all is good. There are a number of ways we can think about this. One is neurons are reacting to the reward. So these neurons are somehow encoding value. And whenever that's the case, then whenever we see something that's rewarding, every time we see something that is good for us, we would expect these neurons to fire. And that is what they're going to go forward and test. Like, are these neurons responding to reward, or are they responding to something else? And one of the ways you can test that is that instead of just having the reward appear out of nowhere, you can preface it with this flashing light, this conditioned stimulus. And that's what happens in the second figure. So again, here, starting on the left, rat is going about its business. It's being a rat. It is having a ratty time of its life. And now we have a light flashing. So out of nowhere, light flashing. And these same neurons now react to the light flashing. This is important because at this point, we have no reward happening. There's no juice. Nothing happens. This flashing light doesn't really represent anything to the rat other than, hey, it knows that after a while, a reward is going to occur. So we see a spike here, not related to the reward, but related to the prediction of reward. And we follow along. And then after a while, the reward happens. So, just as predicted, after seeing the flashing light, the rat will wait about a second, and then it'll get its drop of juice. The interesting thing here is that if you look at what happens when the reward arrives, I don't know if you actually see my cursor, but I'm trying to circle the region of the graph. There is no reaction. There's nothing whatsoever. These neurons just stay completely at baseline, even though just before we established that when a reward happens out of nowhere, these neurons would react to the reward. But now the reward happens, but it is prefaced by the flashing light. The neurons don't care anymore. There are a couple of ways to interpret this data, but the really elegant one these guys came up with is that they interpret it in terms of prediction error. That is, what these neurons are reacting to is not the value, it's not the reward itself. It is deviations from what is predicted by the model that the rat has inside of its head. So if it's going along in the top row about baseline, and then suddenly a reward happens out of nowhere, that causes a prediction error, because the rat had no idea that suddenly it would get juice and life would be better. And then we see the neurons reacting. Likewise, in the second row, we have baseline activity, just going about a business. And then the light starts flashing. We had no idea the light would start flashing, so we get a spike in activity. That is, there's an error in our prediction, and we encode that with spikes of neurons. However, now that the light has flashed, we also expect that a second later we'll get a reward. So when the reward actually happens, we get no errors. Right? This is completely consistent with what is predicted by the model that the rat has inside of its head. To sort of further hammer this point home, we can look at the third row. So again, starting from the left, baseline, all is good in the hood. Go along our business. Light starts flashing. Light starts flashing, we see a spike in activity. We have an error here, we have a prediction error. We go along, go back to baseline. But then once the reward is supposed to come, we're here. Instead, we get nothing. And what we see is a cessation of neural activity. So instead of this thing suddenly being present, we didn't expect to be there, like the reward in the first row or the flashing light. Now there's a thing that we expect to be there. So remember, the rat has learned this mapping, but it doesn't happen. And we can see the brain reacting to this by just ceasing activity. These neurons are not firing, they're below baseline. And to me, this is a really clear demonstration that at least what this part of the brain does, rats, is that it encodes a model of how the world works. It has a model, it generates predictions. It's constantly in the business of trying to infer what is going to happen next. And what the neurons react to are errors in these predictions. That is similar to when we get data that is not well predicted by our model, we need to update it. In this case, when the rat gets observations that are not well predicted by its internal model, we can see that directly encoded in the neural firing rates. To me, this is just like a beautiful, beautiful piece of clear experimental science. Like, it's a simple setup, it's a clear hypothesis, and it's very nicely constructed experiments and very, very, to me, clear and convincing results. And this is just beautiful, beautiful science. And sort of, for good measure, in the paper, they do a lot of really nice temporal difference, sort of reinforcement learning type modeling. That also somehow explains this, but explaining it in terms of prediction errors and generative models, to me, is a really nice, parsimonious way to understand this data. So yeah, that is the Bayesian brain, the idea that what the brain does is it predicts the world around you, and what it encodes in large parts and all the firing and all the activity that's going on is prediction errors. And then by updating your synapses and your connection strengths, everything, we're trying to update the model so that we can better predict what the world is like in the future. Does this make sense to everybody? Would you call this training from our perspective or learning from the rat's perspective, or both? You can say that it's both. Like, training is also a form of learning, I'd say, especially if you go at it from the lens of Bayesian modeling, where you would say that both training and learning is all about updating the model. Where training would be deliberately trying to update your model to do something, and learning would be, well, updating your model, but not necessarily with a purpose. Does that answer your question? Awesome, great. All right, so then again, this is the Bayesian brain. I think the Bayesian brain is a beautiful, simple idea, and this is just a glorious piece of experimental science at the level we should all aspire to. Okay, so what else can we do? Well, we can look again at free energy. And the reason we want to look at free energy now is because Well, the world is a big and complicated place. Like, the world is huge. There's so much stuff going on there. There's so much complexity that it's unlikely that you can represent everything that's going on. Instead, what your brain likely does is it has an approximate model of how the world works. So you don't model all the details of everything that's ever happened. You keep an approximation that is good enough for most purposes. So this here is free energy functional. You've seen this guy before. I'm going to use a slightly different notation where I condition everything on a set of controls. So these would be, in your case, like the state of your muscles, or if we're designing a synthetic agent like rotors or whatever control signals we can think of. I'm going to use S for all the internal states, and I'm going to use X for all the observations. And let me see what my next slide is. Right, yeah. X for all the observations. So again, one way we can think of what the brain does is that we can think of it as trying to minimize its variation of free energy. We're trying to match up our approximate model of the world, this Q, with our idealized model of the world, with the real model of the world, and constrained by some priors over where we want various internal variables to be. So this is just saying, instead of doing exact Bayesian inference, we do approximate Bayesian inference, and we want to line up these two distributions, similar to what we talked about earlier. And I'm going to condition everything on these control states. So now we can optimize its free energy, not just by updating our model, but also by directly affecting the world around us. That is, given that I did something, what would my free energy be? And again, you've seen this before, because I know Bert has talked about it. We can decompose the free energy into an accuracy and a complexity term. Again, further sort of hammers this point home, that we have some priors that we don't want to deviate from. And we're still trying to accurately make sense of the world around us. So we're looking for the simplest model that conforms with our priors, and accurately predicts incoming sensory data. I'm going a little bit quick here because I know you've seen this before. I'm just trying to, again, put a different spin on it. Because if we think of this in the context, again, of the Bayesian brain and of this idea that living systems are performing inference, again, it becomes, to me at least, very clear very quickly that doing this approximate inference, where we do not have to represent the entire world inside of our head at once, can lead to some really, really nice interpretations. All right, enough about all this. What does it look like if we actually want to build things? So the nice thing about variational inference, as you learned last week in Bert's lecture on intelligent agents, is that we can use this to design controllers. We can use this to design systems that do things. The logic here is similar to how we expect a living system to work. Just instead of running it on wetware, on all the neurons inside your head, we can take out the equations and we can simulate it on a computer, and we can get really cool things. So what is shown here is an agent, or the trajectory of an agent, that lives on a 1D number line, and it has where it has position. That is the blue line, and there is a heat source on this number line, and it has a preference for keeping its body temperature at 4 degrees, because 4 is a good number for this agent. And as we get closer to the heat source, there's this nice nonlinear relationship where everything gets hot very, very quickly close to the heat source, and then dramatically sort of falls off as we get further away. Similar to how an actual heat source works. If we have an agent that just acts in the moment, no planning, no consideration for anything, and it's doing these two things, it's updating its beliefs. So it's trying to infer what, given observations of my position, observations of the temperature, where am I and how warm am I? And it is intervening in the data generating process by moving along this number line. Out of just that, performing inference, we can get an agent that is able to move from down here, up, overshoot a little bit, and then eventually settle into this nice stable position, where the temperature, the orange line, is right bang on where we want it to be. So in terms of biological agent, this would correspond to positioning yourself relative to a heat source so that your body temperature remains as it should be. Does that make sense to everybody? Oh, there's a question that I didn't catch. I don't have the chat on the screen at the same time as the slides, unfortunately. So Stefan asked whether the same pattern occurs with a 10-minute or 1-hour delay. And I say probably not, because learning associations over that long are very, very difficult, especially if you're a rat. Theoretically, you should be able to do so with enough conditioning. But it's unlikely that we can actually see it, because that's a lot of long-term memory for a rat. You can probably think of situations from your own life where something like that would happen, for instance. You have a prediction about something that happened in an hour, and then time rolls around and it doesn't. So, but yeah, the idea with the agent here is this is just an agent that's minimizing prediction errors, and is doing so by A, intervening in the data generating process, and B, updating its beliefs. This is an example of a very simple agent that you can construct using these principles that will allow you to do simple control. Like this could be a cruise control, for instance, that keeps speed of a car within some very tightly defined bounds. That's really why cool work on adapting generative models with fault-tolerant controls based on this as well. Again, I'm not asking you to be impressed with the fact that we can find a number on the line. I'm asking you to think about the way it's done and why that may be interesting, sort of as proof of concept that we can build more complicated things with more complicated generative models. Okay. So the thing about this type of agent is that if you write this out, it's a bunch of differential equations, and it just acts in the moment. At any time point, this agent is just like reflexively responding to what is happening. Saying, I'm too warm, let me move away. I'm too cold, let me move closer. There's a lot of planning or a lot of deliberation, or a lot of sort of high-level reasoning going on here. It's not an agent that considers the future. This is the type of intelligence you would see from, say, a bacteria or a virus or something. Something that is completely in the moment, reflex-driven. Which is, that's all fine, well and good. But it doesn't quite capture all that we want out of living systems. Like you guys, for instance, you are able to plan ahead for several years. In some cases, you're all doing a degree that is like 3 to 5 years. And that is because you expect that something will happen either during or after that time that's going to be good for you. So you have a lot longer horizons that you can consider rather than just the moment. I'm just going to quickly switch back here. Okay. If you have questions, like just say something, because I'm not sure I'm always going to catch them in the chat. Right. So if we want to work with agents that plan, then we're going to pull this figure again. Now we're going to go and look at something that looks very, very much like the types of intelligent agents that Bert introduced last week. The trick here is that we can take our graph this in the moment filtering type graph. And we can just add time steps into the future. Right? That's something we can do. I can make this graph longer by just adding nodes up until some planning horizon. And that allows us to, again, use the same types of principles, this fact that we're doing variational inference, to now model systems that can plan, can think ahead. And there are practically a couple of ways to do this. Because once you start thinking ahead, you also get into a situation where you have to consider future data. Right? And for this purely data-driven approach that we've looked at, that presents a problem. So how do you update your model based on data before you have any data? Right? So there are a couple of ways we can get around this. One is, we as designers of this agent, we can manually terminate the graph. Right? So we can fill up these nodes with what we want. And then if we do that in a clever way, we'll get an agent that can do control in order to bring about these observations. And it'll do so in a very, very nice way. It's a really nice way of thinking about stochastic control. But there are other ways we can go about working with the future. And one thing we can do, for instance, is we have our free energy. We can take the expectation of our free energy. Right? What's allowed? Something we can do. So what I've done here is and I promise I won't really throw a lot of equations at you. There's going to be like 2 on these slides, and that's the whole thing. So what I've done here is simply that I've said, well, I can generate observations based on my state. So if you imagine this graph, we're rolling it forwards, and we're just, instead of passing messages up from observations towards the state, we're passing messages forwards through a likelihood model. And we're looking at, well, what would the observations be given a particular sequence of controls? So given that I do a particular sequence of things, what am I likely to see? I'm outside. If I put on a jacket, I'm likely to observe that I get warmer. This is a thing that we can do. There's nothing stopping us from doing this. The question is why? Why would we want to do this? What is the point of this exercise? The point is that I can take this and I can decompose it. So what I'm doing here is I'm just splitting out the log of px here. And then we can split this expectation. And now we get something that's really interesting. So now we get a term that is looks sort of like an information gain, which is, if you squint a little bit, you can think of this as the reduction in uncertainty gained from knowing X relative to not knowing X. That's a little bit of an approximation error here, but that's the thing that we can do. This quantifies how much we would learn in the future from a particular observation. And we can pair that with this cross entropy term, which really just is trying to match up this Q of X with this P of X. That is, given that I can set up some priors over the types of observation that I would want, i.e., I would want my body temperature to be at 37 degrees, for instance. This term here is going to drive our agents as a function of action, because we're conditioning in U, towards realizing this body temperature of 37. Is we're matching up this P and this Q. Another way to think of it with some terminology that I like is that we have an epistemic value term. So that is the value of information, the value of learning, the value of being curious, and an instrumental value term, that is how much value do we assign to achieving our goals. And because this is all part of the same functional, and all of this can be done using slightly modified variational inference, we can do all this with the tools that you already know. And what we gain from doing it this way, as opposed to just terminating the graph, is that now we have this explorative information-seeking component to our objective, which will lead to agents that will actively seek out unknown areas of the state space in order to learn about the environment, which to me starts to sound a lot more like what we would expect people to do. If I dump you in an unknown environment, you're going to try and figure out how it works and where you can find shelter and where you can get something to eat and all these things in order to maintain your homeostasis. We can use this to design synthetic agents as well. So what I'm going to show you now is a small video of an agent that optimizes this objective. It does so in a Gaussian process classifier. So we're using this for preference learning for hearing aids, which basically means that we have a setting where people we have a couple of parameters that we need to tune to offset a person's hearing loss. And people can respond to the agent here whether they like it or they don't like it. So if your parameters are off, you tell the agent, this is horrible, this is horrible, this is crap, I don't want anything like this. And the task of the agent is then to find a good set of parameters. So it needs to search the state space to find out what you like. And it needs to do so in an efficient way, because hearing aid users are often elderly people, so we can't bother them incessantly. And honestly, most people would rather be doing what they do in their daily life rather than training their hearing aid. So it's important that this agent can search efficiently. That is, it needs this term, this epistemic value term, to quantify how much it is likely to learn from proposing a particular set of parameters to a user. All this is very abstract, but we can look at it and then it becomes very concrete. But here we have an agent that's tuning two parameters, and what we're visualizing is the objective function. So the orange dot represents the current set of parameters or the current position that the agent is querying. And the green dot is the target. That is, for a simulated user, these are the optimal parameters. And what we can see, which is really neat, this shows 50 trials total, is that this agent will sort of systematically search throughout this space of parameters until it starts to get positive user feedback. So that is, as it is now, where it is close to the target and the user starts saying, this is good, this is good. You very quickly see, very clearly see this trade-off between an agent that explores, goes around and tries to sample, and you can see this is not completely random. There's actually a pattern here. And then an agent that exploits. That is, once it actually finds what it's looking for, it just hammers on the right settings, just hammers on these good observations. And yeah, to me, this is a really nice sort of simple application. You can also think of it as a pirate digging for treasure. And once he finds the treasure, he just keeps digging and digging and digging and digging because there's more gold to be had. But to me, this illustrates really nicely that if we think about problems in this way, we design a generative model, we figure out the kind of function that we want to optimize, then we can get really, really, really nice applications out. This is quite data efficient because we're technically learning a classifier from only negative examples up until we get the, up until here, basically, where the agent finds the correct set of parameters. So stuff like this, for instance, is one of the ways that people are applying this to design practical applications, because I figured that you're stuck with me this far, we shouldn't just do all theory, we should actually do a bit of applications as well. Let's check how much time we have left. All right, we have a little bit to go. So now sort of the meat of what I wanted to show. So now we can crank it up. Now we can just like go nuts and see how far we can actually push this line of thinking. And to do so, we're going to look at this graph again. We looked at it a bunch of times, and there's a bunch of different things we can notice. Like we found the Markov blanket, and you can treat this as a state space model to do control, and there's all these neat things you can do. But what I want you to pick out now is the fact that all the nodes are blank. And besides these equalities in the middle, all the nodes are blank. And that means that we can put whatever we want in there. As long as we respect this graph structure, we can put whatever we want in here. Let's say we take this node. That's a node we could be interested in for various reasons. Let's say we take this node. Now, as long as we respect these edges going out here, as long as we respect the Markov blanket of that node, the dependency relations, we can put whatever we want in there. Like for instance, I could put an entire state space model. I could replicate the entire same structure over again at a different time scale, because now this lives in only one time step of this model, but we're still only dealing with one node. I want to take care of the Markov blanket. I want to take care of the connections, the edges. We can put this entire thing into a node. And that means so far, we haven't considered really like time scales or spatial scales or anything of the sort. And what I want to get at here is there's a very natural way to think of nested systems and hierarchical systems and things working at different temporal and spatial scales within this framework. Because as long as you take care of the edges, as long as you take care of the Markov blankets, everything else is just Bayesian inference. So that means we can think of a cell having a Markov blanket at the cell membrane, your organs having a Markov blanket. They're made up of cells, true. They're made up of nodes, all these little guys, with their own Markov blankets. But an organ can be made up, can have its own Markov blanket at the boundary of, say, the lungs and the nerves. And again, stick a bunch of those together. As long as we take care of the dependency relations, we can now construct you out of a jumble of organs and tissue. And you will also be a coherent thing with the Markov blanket during Bayesian inference, and so on and so forth. So one of the ways we can push this even further is to say, well, so far we've talked mostly about stuff on the right side here. We talked about Markov blankets, so sensory channels where data gets in and channels where you send controls out. We're talking about all your internal states, all your temperature variables and whatnot that you need to keep in line. But there's this entire other part of the graph representing everything else that we haven't really touched. And one thing we can do, for instance, is we can sort of partition this way, where we say, hang on, the world is also composed of an agent with its own Markov blanket, with its own sensory and active states. And now the active states of one agent become the sensory states of another. That is, when I do something, I influence you, and in turn, when you do something, you influence me. Now we have this circular structure going on. So we can think of everything else in the world, not just the agent, but everything else, as composed of objects, or agents or systems, delineated by Markov blankets that are all interacting by just doing Bayesian inference for things that are local. And because as long as we take care of all the dependency relations and all the blankets, we can keep scaling this up, both in terms of adding more things to the graph. I can have 2 agents in the blue box, for instance, if I want. We can do so also in terms of spatiotemporal scales. That is, we can put things inside of nodes, as long as we take care of the dependency relations in the blankets, and everything else follows. All of this can be done using all of the tools that you have already learned. So just doing Bayesian and variational inference is enough to start thinking about all these different kinds of things. So yeah, that is, at least towards the end, my attempt at a very, very deflationary answer to the question that we started with: what is life? If you take this view, if you get on board, you drink the Kool-Aid, you get on board with this line of thinking, we can think of life and living systems as nothing more than systems that are consistently performing Bayesian inference to occupy some non-equilibrium steady state in order to stay alive. And as long as we take care of all the dependency relations of all the Markov blankets, then everything else can be done using the machinery of Bayesian inference that you already know. So that was quite a mouthful. If you've got an interest in this stuff and you want to go look a bit more, there are a few recommendations here that are sort of split into 3 categories for where to look. First is sort of the lighthearted introduction. There's a video by Sean Carroll called "What is the Purpose of Life?", where he takes a slightly different interpretation of the same type of ideas. But again, we're in this realm of living organisms doing Bayesian inference and minimizing free energy. There's a blog post by Kai Ulthofer called "Life and the Second Law," where again he relates living systems to these ideas of free energy minimization. And there's another video by a guy called Maxwell Randstad, who's also a pretty cool dude, where he gives a tutorial on active inference, which is another name for this idea of designing agents and thinking about agents as doing inference, the inference part, but also acting upon the world, so it's active inference. It's a little bit more long form, sort of an academic presentation. It inspired quite a lot of the earlier parts of today's talk. I'd highly recommend it. Then if you want to go a little bit deeper, one of the best places to start to get a more sort of proper mathematical grounding for some of the ideas, because we've been very high level today, is a paper by Christopher Buckley, which is called A Mathematical Review of the Free Energy Principle. He goes through and outlines the agent that does the temperature, so the sort of virus-like immediate agent that we looked at earlier. And then 3 of my favorite papers by Carl, where one speaks to his interpretation of how you can think about these, of the brain as doing Bayesian inference, is the first one. Knowing one's place is about systems that self-organize non-equilibrium steady states, and shows these really cool things with morphogenesis and cells organizing into coherent structures only by minimizing local free energy. And then free energy value and attractors, which is sort of a heavier paper, gets into this idea of random systems that converge to non-equilibrium steady states. And finally, for those of you who are really brave, under the Here Be Dragons heading, Carl wrote a 150-page monograph that details, it's probably the most comprehensive document on this line of thinking. But fair warning, it's a mouthful. I spent several months trying to parse what was going on in there. It's worth it though if you can make it through. And that is everything that I have scheduled for today. So I don't know how much time we've got left, but I want to thank you for sticking around, and thank you for following the course. I hope that by the end of this, that you were somewhat inspired, or at least you are now aware that besides just doing data processing, there's a lot of really cool things you can do with Bayesian inference. Hopefully some of you would be interested in exploring some of these ideas, because there's still a lot of work to do, and from experience, it's a really cool place to be. So thank you for sticking around. And then I'm going to hand it over to Bert to sort of round everything off.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Magnus. This was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure the students also have enjoyed it. I just want to say goodbye also to the students, also on behalf of Wouter. It was a pleasure to do this class. The circumstances, of course, weren't good. Everything online again. I really appreciate everybody who attended, all your questions on Piazza. That really helped a lot, gave us an opportunity and gave also the students an opportunity to think about what you read and to explain it a bit more. As for the exam, focus on understanding, on basic understanding of what we've been doing. There are exercises where you sometimes have to make a derivation of 10 lines of math. That's not going to be happening on the exam. The best way to prepare would be probably also to really review the old exams, because that's the style of the upcoming exam. It's going to be multiple choice with minor computations and quite some just understanding how to apply probability theory to machine learning, because that's what this class is about. And yeah, we enjoyed it, and wish you all the best at the exam. And then I think we're gonna sign off. And so Piazza, of course, stays up until after the exam. So anytime, just keep asking your questions on Piazza, and we'll be there to help you. Okay. Bye bye then.
Awesome. I'll stop the recording then.
Okay.
And we're off the